Well, it's great to see all of you. Who got up the earliest this morning? Anybody get up before 5 a.m.? Anybody get up before 4 a.m.? I can't sleep before these events, so I keep fearing my alarm clock will not go off, so I set 3 of them and I still don't sleep. So it's good to be here. Everybody, if you can kind of move this way a little bit so as people come in, they can take the end seats. And I see people from all over. I can tell you the person that came from the closest to me, because she lives right across the street, Joyce Darren, who's a former principal, right, in Plymouth. And who came the farthest this morning? Anybody from farther than Detroit? Yeah. Where did you go from? Milford. Okay, that's a pretty good ride. And the roads are all right. No snow. That's good. So we're gonna just do a few announcements and jump into this. I know there are a lot of people here who have not been here before. So if you're new to LeadersConnect, could you just maybe raise your hand? Whoa, that's great. Fantastic. All right. So
it must be the topic.
It's the topic, yes. Because I've been consistent and you didn't show up for you. We've been going for about 20 years. I was going to have the 20th anniversary, but I have no idea when I actually started this, and my computer has crashed so many times that. But it was before. It was in the 90s, I know. So we've been going for a while, and LeadersConnect brings together leaders from all walks of life in the Ann Arbor and Detroit and Lansing area. So, how many of you are from the world of education in this? Okay, so how many from higher education? All right. So several from the University of Michigan. Any other colleges represented? Eastern, I think we had. And then how many of you are from the private sector? Okay, a few of you. Andrews, your entrepreneurs. Bill, who's selling some buildings. I see your Milliken sign around there.
Yes, sir.
Noise going on there. I think there's barbecue's kicking up. Everybody complains when they leave here that they smell like barbecue, so you actually have to buy something to bring back. Explain how you got that barbecue smell. This is a May event. We've got one more event in this season, which is going to be the Dean of the School of Business. We have another Dean here, School of Education, but Scott DeRue, who's my boss, because I teach at the school, will be here, and also he's bringing Melanie Barnett, who is the head of executive education. So we're going to try to have an event where the community learns what they can do to interact with the school system, the university. Kristen Story's here, and she runs part of that training. I don't know if some of that open to the public, Kristen? All open. So maybe you could come next month too and talk about what's happening, because we want to try to open up the idea that connect, part of LeadersConnect, is trying to connect different parts of the community. Because I think to be strong, we are needing to bring together the private sector, anybody from the non-profit sector, but not education. What do you do?
I run the National Network Depression Center.
Okay, Depression Center. Anybody here else from the non-profit world? All right, nobody else. And how many of you entrepreneurs are out there? Okay, I know we've got several that have been there a long time. Where's Jimmy? Jimmy, how long have you been in business?
23 years.
23 years. Can anybody beat that for an entrepreneur? You're actually almost not an entrepreneur anymore. But you still think like a startup guy. So Jimmy has a great software business. That's,
all right, Ryan, 30 years.
30. All right, Larry's been there 30
The
years.
cash is still flowing.
All right. Well, great. I think that's all fantastic. So we're going to roll into this. I want to thank our sponsors. Is anybody here from Raymond today?
Yep.
Okay, you want to come up, Deb, and talk a little bit about Raymond? And we thank our sponsors. And Deb is maybe tell you what Raymond is and what you guys are doing and what you might offer people.
Yes. Hi, good morning. We are so happy to sponsor this event. This is a wonderful event. It's one of those things that every time I come, I always take away something. I may not, I don't know. The topics are always interesting, but there's always something. But Raymond is a full-service accounting, CPA firm, financial services firm. We do corporate investigative services, so for people who need background checks, we have that as well. We've recently merged with a technology company, so that's a new addition with all the technology needs that are out there. But we are, like I said, full service business advising, and with all the new tax law changes, if you need any help with that, projections, we're here to help you.
Thank you. I don't believe anybody here from Bank of Ann Arbor today, but Bank of Ann Arbor is another one of our sponsors. And I think Bank of Ann Arbor is well known by everybody, and they're going to be launching their music series in about a month, so that'll be fun to go to Liberty Plaza. And they're a fantastic bank sponsoring us and sponsoring many, many community activities, and also doing some of the services that we all need as business people. Roger Rail on camera here is got a video and technology service that he graciously provides to the community, and he is taping this event, and it will be on next week sometime. We'll launch it on YouTube channel, LeadersConnect YouTube channel, and we have all these past events, most of them anyway, on that channel. So it's a great educational opportunity if you want to go back and hear some amazing speakers. So that's what's going on. There's a couple other quick announcements. I've launched a new endeavor. I've actually been an entrepreneur. I guess you could consider being a therapist an entrepreneurial activity. I'm in business for myself for about 40-some years, so I might even be able to beat everybody else. And I have started a new event with Kathleen Stevens here, and this is called the Success Connection. Okay, the Success Connection. If you go to Facebook at Success Connection, did I get that right?
You got it.
I got it. You'll be able to join this community, and it's a community where I'm trying to bring together online some of the things we do here, connecting people who are focused on succeeding in their life. And it's not just career, but succeeding in their family and in their health and everything else to be a successful person. We're launching that on Facebook, but we're going to also launch a podcast soon, where we'll be able to do these kind of things through podcasts. So hopefully some of you could be my guests. So I think that's all the announcements. I'll let you know one other thing that, talking about the new technology, Debbie, I've got an app that students have created for me, which is going to be an Alexa app where you set your daily or monthly goals. And you tell Alexa, and she keeps it in her secret life. Nobody hears of it. Nobody, Jeff Bezos is not interested in what your goals are, maybe, but he will then, Siri, what am I saying? I'm in trouble. Alexa will then check in with you later in the day about how you've done in achieving your goals. So I had a group of students from the Computer Science Center set that up, and we'll see how it goes. Further delving into not only your psyche, but your privacy. So that's my goal. All right, so I'm going to introduce the panel, and I'm just going to do real quick introductions. I don't remember all of these things, and some of you folks I've just met, and some I've known for a few years. So Elizabeth Moje, is that correct? And she is the Dean of the School of Education, University of Michigan. And I was telling Elizabeth that her school is responsible for me getting my first job as a teacher, because it's 1967 and the war in Vietnam is raging, and Rob Pasick does not particularly want to go to this war. So I had this brilliant idea I would get some education classes. And I had worked with kids in playgrounds and stuff. So I went to school and got enough education credits that when I went to New York City, they hired me as what they called an above quota substitute. So I taught school for 2 years in Harlem, so that gives me some credit with this group. Welcome. And then we have Christine Stead. Did I say this right? Okay. And Christine and I and Jeanice met a few years ago at one of those Michigan football events, I think. And we've been talking about putting this program on for about 2 years, so I'm really excited to do that. Christine is the president of the school board. And she's also very active running her own business, which is called
Headlamp Advisors.
Headlamp Advisors. You advise to healthcare, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So she's a healthcare, to hospitals and things like that. And she has, how many kids? Two? And they both in high school, right?
Skyline.
Skyline, okay. And she's a hockey fanatic, so you were happy with the hockey season this year. She
Yes,
did
very
good,
much,
yeah?
yes.
Yeah, great. Do you have any of those kids in your program? No?
He's at BC.
Okay, all right, good. And then Nicholas Vitti, did I pronounce? Nikolai Vitti. And I'm trying to remember how to say it right, and I remembered my Latin, which is Vitti, something like that, so I got it, said it right, yes. And Nikolai, we were talking earlier, Detroit area, grew up and then went to school, and schools in the South at Wake Forest, and then has taught, been superintendent, became superintendent in Florida, and now he's the superintendent of the Detroit Public Schools, and has taken on a huge opportunity and a huge challenge. So welcome, Nikolai. And Jeanice Swift, who we're very happy to have here, still have here, so that's good. And Jeanice has done an amazing job of, the schools were good already, but she's made it great in Ann Arbor and has created all kinds of opportunities for students of all persuasions, I would say, to find an education. There are now, like, how many opportunities for high school in Washington County? Do you have any idea?
In the district, 5.
5 opportunities for high school. That's great, yeah, because we all grew up with one, right? So now we have many alternatives, and Jeanice has been really a great mind and a great leader in the educational and the community as a whole. So I'm going to let Jeanice kick things off. The topic today is around generally safety in schools. And that's a huge topic. We're certainly not going to be able to touch on everything. And I think what comes to mind first, of course, is the guns and the shootings and the violence. But we're going to make it broader than that and talk about some of the social emotional things like bullying and whatever else you folks might be doing. So the format is going to be each presenter is going to talk for a few minutes, about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a brief conversation kind of following up with each other, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So we're going to be wrapped up by 9. I know some people have to leave a little early. I know you do, Elizabeth. And if some of you have to leave earlier, that's fine. But we'll try to actually bring the program to a halt around 10 to 9. And if you have any announcements about things that are going on in the community that you want people to talk about, you want to talk to people about, I'll give you an opportunity. One thing I do want to promote, I forgot, was Michigan Heart Walk is tomorrow. And it's a great event. A couple of us, how many of you are going to do that? I know a couple of us are going to do it, right? Okay, so that's going to be, I guess they have everything. I'm going to do the 1 mile. And they've got 3 mile and 6 miles, so it should be a good thing. And so I'm going to, without any further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Jeanice and let you have the mic. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert. It's great to be here with you. How are you today? Good. What a great group. And what a great day in Ann Arbor and Ann Arbor Public Schools to have, and Detroit, to have this conversation. We've been busy, as you know, thinking about our number 1 priority that comes even before our critical mission of teaching and learning. You always think in K-12 education that teaching and learning is the first and the last thing we think about, but we've been busy thinking about that other priority, which is the safety of our students and our staff. Our journey, our most recent chapter, began in March of 2015 on one evening at Pioneer High School when a citizen openly carried a gun into a choir concert. We didn't go looking for this endeavor. We had a lot of work to do with our priorities of teaching and learning. And yet, our community felt very strongly. I'm so proud of President Stead and our board, who felt very strongly that it should not be okay. And part of our background, as you all probably know, is that there is just a wide body of federal legislation and state school code and everything we've been hardwired to do for my 30 years in public education has been about protecting our students and recognizing the presence of a gun in school as a 911 emergency. So you can imagine how incongruous it is to all of a sudden think that any citizen from anywhere could just walk right in with a gun. Over this spring, it's been so inspiring to see our students rise up. And I don't know if you've seen our Washtenaw Youth Initiative. How many of you have seen those guys? Aren't they impressive? So our students in this county have risen up, and I just report to them and ask them what I'm supposed to do next. They generally give me very clear and specific direction about where to show up and how to support their efforts, which is really a wonderful way for it to go. How many of you have students currently in the Ann Arbor Public Schools? There you are. Thank you. That's wonderful. And how many of you are alumni of Ann Arbor Public Schools? There you are. Great. Well,
We even have a student.
and we do have a student. Do we have a current student? Logan. Oh, Logan. Great. That's wonderful. Well, I want to remind us that, and I know we all know this, we get close to the child and the message and the path is very clear. And that is that the classroom and the school should be warm and welcoming place for students to grow and learn under the watchful eye of a professional educator. And those of you who've spent much time in schools, we certainly have. Schools are very busy places, and we feel like the distraction of a gun, of the presence of a gun in a school is a detriment to that. It's frightening for children. Children cannot learn when they're scared. A good number of our students, and certainly a good number of your students, Dr. Vitti, come from homes of trauma, and they've experienced trauma. They see the school and the classroom as a safe place to come every day, as a warm and welcoming place, and we want to keep it that way. So just to summarize kind of our 3-year chapter that we've been on, the board got busy after that March, and by the end of April passed 3 policies. The policies are very simple and straightforward. We consider the presence of a gun in school, other than in the hands of a sworn officer of the law, to be an emergency. That documents what we know exists in federal and state law, and we put it into our policies. And so it is a part of the Ann Arbor Public Schools. The approach, though, is around the disruption that the gun causes. So I just want to be clear that our focus is on children, and just as you mentioned, Robert, it's on social, emotional well-being and creating a positive and productive place for students to learn. That's our number one mission. Those policies have been upheld now at 2 court levels, and most recently on April 11th were before the Michigan Supreme Court. Now, we don't know the outcome of that endeavor yet, but we are waiting and hoping to hear something over the coming months about our next steps with this process. In the meantime, because our policies have survived, because our policies have survived in the court, they remain in effect in the Ann Arbor Public Schools. I'm proud to say that the citizens of this community have respected that law. We've had very few issues about that. I don't know, this is the end of my 5th year in the Ann Arbor Public Schools, and I don't recall any other issue where folks have spoken so clearly, so loudly, so much in unison, and that includes our students. So again, we have one priority, and that's teaching and learning and preparing the next generation. We're focused on creating an environment that results in good, strong learning, healthy, appropriate development of children for every one of our 18,140 students that come to us every day. We start with students at a few months of age in our system, go all the way through seniors in high school and through 26 years of age with special needs students. So we feel like we host a continuum of students who will grow and learn and do well if we protect and support the environment in which they learn every day. So our mission and our focus is clear. We appreciate the support of our community. We also appreciate the counter voice. And I just want to touch on that for a minute before I hand this over. I know that there's a lot out there, and I hear from folks every day because of the stand we've taken, who say the best thing to keep my child safe or to keep schools safe is to counter a bad guy with a gun with a good guy with a gun. And so, I hear that often, and you do too in the media. We were just reminded, and I wrote about this not long ago, of 3 incidents right here in Michigan nearby where very responsible folk accidentally lost control of their weapon inside of a school. And so we know that this is not the right thing. I was also reminded of the shooting in Arizona of Gabby Giffords, and just read a New York Times piece not long ago where they told a story you may or may not have heard about a good guy with the gun who arrived on that scene just after the shooting, was not clear who the good guy was and who the bad guy was, and just was seconds away from creating even more mayhem and death there at that scene. So we feel like if we want to test that theory of having good guys with guns, we should probably start that in the state house, in the courthouse, in places that are populated by adults, rather than starting that that practice in places that are populated by our children. So it's not that we're, as an institution, not in favor of trying some things. We just don't think it should be at school. So that's our position, and I'm so pleased to get to be with you and to get to be a part of this great event, and appreciate all your support, all the support of our Ann Arbor community. And I guess Nikolai's next, right? Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So a lot to talk about. I don't want to repeat what was already well said. So I'll take it from a bit of a national perspective, and then also talk about Detroit. So a lot to say on this topic. I would say, one, this conversation that has now become a national conversation because of the Parkland incident and other incidents that unfortunately have happened, is always interesting in the Detroit context, because a lot of our children face violence on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in the home, whether it's in the neighborhood, when they're walking to and from school every day. And it's, for me, as superintendent of DPSCD, it sometimes honestly is hurtful to hear the conversation and the level of concern that is legitimate about children's safety day to day in schools that tend to be more suburban and more affluent. And it's hard for me not to hear that conversation and feel that sometimes we have different levels of priority on children based on race and socioeconomic background. Because a lot of our children, again, face that level of fear and violence on a day-to-day basis, just walking to and from school, and we don't have this sense of urgency and outrage over the fact that our children in this country still cannot go to school every day and feel safe. And so we should be outraged that all children throughout the country don't feel safe in school because of the threat of violence, but that is happening to lots of our children based on where they just grow up every day in the neighborhood that they're in. We're not having enough of a national conversation about that. With that said, many of our students feel more safe in school than they do in their homes sometimes and in their greater neighborhood. Our schools are sanctuaries for a lot of our children. And so it's always interesting when I talk to people outside of Detroit and they talk about the level of violence in our schools, or even the threat of gun violence. It's ironic because most of our students, again, will say, I feel safer in school than I do in my home or in my neighborhood. So I don't think most of our children actually don't come to school feeling that there will be a major act of violence from a gun in our schools. They feel like that is more likely to happen in their neighborhoods, whether they're walking to and from school, whether they're playing in a park, which they don't do much anymore because of the fear of random violence in the greater community. So I just want to use this opportunity to also highlight the fact that there is a need for a national conversation and a sense of urgency around the fact that many students who are growing up in urban core cannot go to the local store with the scent or even to the park anymore because of the fear of random violence. We have police, we are the only school district in Michigan that have our own police force. And we have police officers that are armed in all of our secondary schools, and then we have security guards in all of our elementary schools. We have metal detectors in most of our schools, and it's interesting because I try to conduct frequent, I call it chats with the soup, with students and teachers and administrators. And most recently, talking to high school students, they actually want the metal detectors. And I wouldn't say I've been superintendent in mainly large urban school districts, but I've also in large urban county systems. I've worked with more suburban schools as well in the county system, and often you hear we need metal detectors, and I've pushed back on that. But when talking to our students in Detroit, they want the metal detectors because it gives them a sense of comfort about what could be coming in from the outside. I philosophically and ideologically have a concern with metal detectors because I think it creates a prison mentality within our schools. But this is a good example of myself as superintendent actually listening to our kids. And our high school students will say, we're not ready yet to get rid of the metal detectors. We hope that there's a day we don't need metal detectors, but right now I go to school every day and I feel more safe because of the metal detector. I think, to unpack that psychologically, I think it's also comforting, no different than I think for all of us when we're about to board an airplane. There's a level of comfort when we go through a security check system. Although factually it does very little to prevent any kind of horrific event. It's psychologically comforting to go through that process, but if you do look at the research, it's very little that will be stopped because of that. Same thing with the metal detector in schools. Having been in the Bronx in New York as a head dean of discipline in a 4,000 student high school, I saw weapons get into school all the time, even though we had a metal detector. Not to scare anyone, but if you Google ceramic weapons, you can see very terrifying weapons that can be brought in that are ceramic that can get into school. And there's also ways of getting weapons in school outside of the metal detectors through the adults that could smuggle weapons in, or there's other entrance points in school. So that's not to scare people. I just try to talk with reality, with what can happen. So what I often say, and the culture that we're trying to build, is that the best metal detector is a relationship between children and adults. As a head dean of discipline, as a teacher, as a principal, what I have found is we have prevented violent acts or having guns in schools or weapons in schools when children feel comfortable enough and safe enough to report that to another adult. And so when you create a culture of transparency, when you create a culture of everyone owning a safe environment, then it's not about snitching. It's about creating a culture that you expect everyone to hold accountable to. And in this sense, children will say, I heard that he has a gun. I've heard that he has a knife. Or I've heard that she and this group have a feud that could lead into something violent. And then when the adults are notified, you bring those children in, have those conversations, bring the parents in. I honestly believe that is the best deterrent when we're talking about preventing horrific acts. A metal detector will only go so far. If you really look at the mass shootings that have occurred in this country, a metal detector would not have prevented any of those from occurring. And I would go even farther, and I completely agree. Even having armed guards or armed officers in schools, that in and of itself would not prevent a mass shooting. It is a sense of security that you obtain psychologically. But even at Parkland, and I'm familiar with that area because I worked in Miami-Dade, as chief academic officer, there was an officer assigned to that school. And that officer decided not to respond, and there's criticism about that, but ultimately the officer felt that he would be outgunned if he entered that building. So, and I'm going to shift a little bit now on a more national level. I am a parent, I'm an educator, I'm a citizen, and I believe our greatest challenge right now is gun control. In this country. When you look at mass shootings in schools, this is not happening throughout the world. This is happening in America. And it's happening in America. If you look at all the factors, we can talk about video game violence. That kids in Germany play video games. Kids throughout the world play violent video games. This is not unique to America. People talk about issues of poverty, and this in and of itself is a stereotype often linked to racism, that somehow poverty is linked to violence. These incidents are not happening in the urban core, everyone. It's happening in suburban, mainly America. So it's not a poverty issue. We say, well, it's a mental health issue. We have mental health issues throughout our country, but mental health is not specific to America. Mental health permeates our entire human race, right? So it's not that. The singular factor that is very unique in this country is access to weapons. And I'm not saying that we eliminate weapons and we eliminate mass shootings, but if you look at in other countries throughout the world, Scotland, for example, had a mass shooting, if I recall, in the mid-90s. Very similar to what's happening here. Students rose up, parents rose up, and they said never again. And they lobbied the legislature in England, in the UK, and gun control was passed. They have not had a mass shooting since. Now, I'm not trying to simplify the issue because I do understand it's a complicated issue. But when individuals with mental health challenges, when young people who are alienated and frustrated have easy access to weapons, it allows that individual that has the mental health issues manifest their mental health challenge is in a violent, destructive way that is easier done in this country than other countries throughout the world. And that's what we need to start having a conversation of. I am not that simplistic in my thinking to say gun control will always eliminate mass shootings. I'm much more complicated as a thinker to know that it's not that simple. But I'm also sophisticated enough to understand that we have to do something about access to weapons in this country because it is leading to what's happening uniquely in this country. And it is only happening in this country. So I want to remind everyone and make everyone go home and think about that. Mass shootings in schools are only happening in the United States of America. Thank you.
Well, welcome, and I wanted to maybe segue into my part of the speech. I'm a politician. You elect me, if you live in this area, to serve on your behalf, to look over our public schools in Ann Arbor. And I'm also a parent, and I live here. And so I think we share a lot of common interests in terms of what's important to us. Part of what I wanted to share with you all today is, one, how important politics are. Because I am a politician, I can tell you, and I don't like to identify with that, but it's actually true. I have to get elected. Part of what my message is who we elect matters. We have in our state Senate and House currently 3 bills that are awaiting the ruling on our Supreme Court case. These bills would basically remove what we put in policy. So we were very thoughtful. We had a great legal team, Dave Comsa, Dr. Swift, and many people came together to help us construct policies that would withstand court challenges because they're based on the safety of our children, a responsibility that is unique to boards of education across the state. We do see the presence of a weapon as a dangerous environment. It's an emergency, and we have charged our superintendent and all of our administrators to treat it as such, to keep our children safe. That has been our strategy for this tactic. However, I'll remind you back in the Sandy Hook days. Sandy Hook happened 4 days before a bill that flew through the House and Senate in our state that would have allowed weapons in gun-free zones. And 4 days after Sandy Hook, our governor, Rick Snyder, vetoed that bill. So it's interesting that 4 days after a mass shooting in a school environment, that seems like a really bad idea. And yet here we are again in the state of Michigan with another set of bills in the House and Senate that largely would remove the ability to have a gun-free zone in schools, is essentially the goal. I would argue that who we elect matters, and that this November election should be very important to people at all levels of government. Boards of education, who sits and represents you in the House and Senate in our state, as well as in Congress, because those are the people passing the kind of policies that make the United States of America the most armed civilian population in the world. So to speak to Nikolai's point, we have actually a lot of good data around this. This is not an unknown thing. The New York Times put out a beautiful data graphic. I don't know if you all saw it, but the U.S. is way up here in terms of guns per capita. And every other country in the world is way over here. These are known things. These are solvable problems. We know the answers to these questions, and we can look to Australia, Japan, the UK, places that have dealt with these questions and done a fine job of maintaining access to guns, but not the way we do, where it's easier to buy a gun than it is to get a cup of coffee. And if you have children like I do in the schools, that is not a good thing. This is not who we are. This is not a great environment for our children. I wanted to shift then on what else we're doing in the Ann Arbor Public Schools, so you all know, around social and emotional supports. And I'll go political again, and I apologize, but in 2016, just during the campaign cycle, we started to see OCR complaints, Office of Civil Rights complaints start to increase at levels we haven't seen in a while. We've had new stresses on our families that are immigrants. We've had to release statements that we are committed to doing what we always have been not able to do, which is check immigration status for our students and families that go here. That's not the role of a public school district. So we've seen our children have increased stress, increased anxiety for a variety of reasons, but that just adds another layer on top of everything else. This past year, the board and Dr. Swift and her team, we decided to put more robust supports in place to help the social and emotional needs of our students at all grade levels. We have a unique program called the Behavioral Interventionalists. They take a very small caseload at the secondary level and now also at the elementary level to focus on just a handful of students and really connect with them. And as a result, we've seen our suspension rates go down. We've seen our graduation rates go up. We've seen these children go from struggling with things that are bigger than maybe what's happening in school to having someone that cares about them specifically, connects with them, and helps them navigate high school successfully. That program has been an enormous success, so much so that this past year we expanded it into our elementary programs. We may shift as we learn and add more social work support. We've added more counselors. We added a dean, basically, at the 9th grade level. This is a role we cut because of our state's defunding public education, but we added this role back in, I think, a maybe even better way. That our deans at the 9th grade level at our 3 comprehensive high schools are particularly focused on helping kids make that transition between 8th grade and high school, which we know is a big change for people. So they have special training, they have CBT type training, they really are focused on how stressful that transition is, and they connect with our kids earlier in the 8th grade level. So we're trying to do everything we can to put more adults that are focused on the health and well-being of our kids. We also have wonderful partnerships with the University of Michigan Depression Center, Ellis Place, a handful of other things, as well as an anonymous text line for our children to use. So if they're worried about a friend that's potentially at risk for suicide or depression or those kinds of things, we've had several very wonderful outcomes this year because of an anonymous text line that kids feel comfortable using. You don't want to tell maybe an adult or somebody near you or your other friends, but you're worried. And we've had several wonderful outcomes where people have been able to come to a child in a moment of crisis and prevent a crisis and help them get the support they need. So this is part of our work all together as a community. We continue to learn and adjust and try to do better. But I wanted to just to reinforce those couple things. One, politics matter. Who you vote for matters. So please vote and know who you're voting for and who they're funded by, and those things go a long way because they do have enormous power and authority to write bills and pass law that create our environment. Two, I would say we're all in this together around guns and gun safety, and I think this national and local and daily conversation around what's reasonable. Let's just have some good common sense, check in with each other, take care of each other. Those things are a really important way as a community to stay connected and help prevent these kinds of traumas. And then the social and emotional supports, here again, we all need to work as a team. If you're worried about anybody's child, far better to ask for forgiveness later than to have there be an incident that is traumatic for the community and for that family. So that's who we are as a team. We do our best work together as always, and those were the few things I wanted to share with you all today to just stay engaged and help us help you too. Thank you.
So good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to start by thanking my colleagues here. We have, two of the most incredible superintendents in the country. It's just such an honor. The University of Michigan School of Education has longstanding partnerships with both Ann Arbor Public Schools and Detroit Public Schools Community District. And so it's just an incredible pleasure to even be in the same space with you. And then to have a board president who is so strong and takes this very strong stance to protect our children and, I should say, our teachers. Yes. That's just really gratifying. And as a parent of an Ann Arbor Schools alum, I'm just really thankful for you, and for the entire board. I would like to build on what Christine shared with us about the sort of psychological and socio-emotional supports and talk about the link between physical violence and psychic violence that our children are experiencing. I want to also emphasize what our teachers are going through. Teachers and leaders, I dare say. Imagine the question of, what am I going to teach today? How am I going to make sure that I'm meeting the needs of all of my children in learning mathematics or science or literacy, and having at the same time to worry about whether someone was going to come into my building with a gun, or, as Dr. Vitti said, whether my children were going to be attacked on the way to school or had experienced some sort of violence or trauma. Imagine that experience of trying to really do a great job of teaching skills and content while also having to think about those kinds of surrounds. And we are in a place in our society where we are allowing these things to happen. And I won't, repeat everything that's been said, but I do want to emphasize the politics matter, and to solve this problem of, how we allow access to guns and to guns, whether in schools or outside of school, we really do have to think about using our vote and using our wisdom and our power much differently. So that's where I want to begin. I want to put that on the table. But now I want to go to the kinds of things that we are doing at the School of Education to try to better educate and support teachers and school leaders for these circumstances. So let's hope we can change the circumstances. But assuming that we can't, what are some of the things we have to do? So first of all, we're a university, we are also a school, and we also face some of these challenges, as you know, only too well. So we are now going through regular active shooter training, and we're doing it on a not daily basis, but a regular basis with our staff, with our students, and with our faculty. So that's one piece. And we're realizing that our schools are not equipped, our classrooms are not equipped to protect us. So we're learning how to run, how to hide, and how to fight. This is taking up a lot of time and a lot of energy and creating a different kind of stress. So that's one thing. We are having to put people through those experiences, which heightens that level of stress that you're talking about. The second thing that we're doing is actually teaching about socio-emotional learning. So on top of everything else, again, that teachers have to think about, we now have to address socio-emotional needs. Now, we should always have been addressing them, but they're at a different level. It's unprecedented, the kind of stress and anxiety we are seeing in very young children. You mentioned bringing these programs into elementary schools. And this is across the socioeconomic spectrum.
Yes.
We're seeing kids who are completely stressed out, not only about school violence or the potential for it, but about things like test scores, things like college entrance, and it's starting when they're 6 and 7 years old. When my daughter was 6 years old, I was trying to get her to go to sleep. She's in Ann Arbor Public Schools. The next day was the MEEP. She was nervous about the MEEP. 6 years old, must have been pre-MEEP because you don't do MEEP testing when you're 6. And she said to me, "Do they still do the California Achievement Test as well?" And I said, "Why do you know about the California Achievement Test? What is it at 6 years old that is making you think about testing?" And, that stress followed her throughout her experience, even in wonderful Ann Arbor Public Schools, and into college. So that kind of stress is already there for our kids, and now they're also thinking about the physical piece. So what are we doing? We work with our teachers. We're developing a trauma-informed practice certificate jointly with the School of Social Work and the School of Nursing. Our piece of it is on trauma-informed teaching because our teachers have to keep teaching. Remember, they're also being held accountable. They're going to be held accountable to test scores and rated highly effective, ineffective, and substandard. And they have to think about that while also thinking about that stress and anxiety and about potential school violence. So this certificate will be available in, we're going to do a hybrid kind of program so that teachers all over the state can have access to it, and in a very short, compact version, because we know the need is so great in our community. The second thing we're doing is a lot of work on restorative justice and restorative practice. And we have found through our partnership with Mitchell, Scarlett, and now Huron High School that when we brought a curriculum focused on restorative practice into the schools, we saw a drop in suspension rates that was radical. Within a few years, we went from something like 189 suspensions at Scarlett to 5. Now, consider the irony of a restorative practices curriculum taught by a teacher who might have a weapon. Because that's the other thing we haven't talked about. We've talked about guns in school, but what about the call to arm teachers? So there's something ironic that we're going to actually teach children how to control themselves, how to make good decisions, how to take responsibility for their behavior, and how to restore justice to their lives. But we might have people holding visible weapons in the classroom teaching them. That seems warped to me. So we are doing that work, but we worry about what the impact of some of these rulings and some of the new laws might be. And then finally, we're really trying to partner with the schools to continue to build out practices that support leaders in learning how to manage the potential for school violence and also those socio-emotional needs of their students and of their teachers, and how to better support throughout all of their practices those different issues and those different needs. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to apologize because I do have to leave. I have to go to Lansing to give a different talk. But I thought this was so important that I wanted to be here with you today. Christine just said we're not going to be arming teachers in Ann Arbor, and I kind of think that's probably true in Detroit. But it is an ironic kind of call, and we're worrying about it in teacher education because we wonder how many people are going to want to go into this profession if the call is to arm teachers and have them ward off would-be shooters while also teaching.
Elizabeth, before you leave it, maybe have the mic there just for a second.
Yeah.
Question for you. I was a consultant at Eastern School of Education where their enrollment has been dropping. Could you talk about just what you touched on? How is it to attract teachers? And then maybe, Nikolai, you could talk about how is it to attract teachers to a district that has the kind of reputation that Detroit might have had.
Sure.
It's definitely challenging these days to attract teachers. It's challenging. It was challenging before the call to arm teachers and before even the really unprecedented level of violence in schools. It's challenging because you might have heard that teachers aren't that well paid, and that they've had pay freezes over the last several years, and they've seen loss of benefits, and they're held accountable for pretty much everything. And let's see, what else can I add to the list? It's really a thankless job. But I will say this, a study at Michigan State has shown that teachers aren't really leaving or resisting entering the profession because of pay. Pay matters, certainly, but it's actually the lack of respect and the lack of professional judgment they're afforded that seems to be the I guess I'll say trigger, to use an unfortunate term in this conversation, for them, that they really are struggling with the idea that they've entered what I would consider the most noble and the most important profession, and they've done it knowing they won't make a lot of money. They're not in it to make a lot of money, and they work endlessly, and they buy school supplies, not in Ann Arbor, but they do in many, many districts, and then on top of it, they're told, we're going to hold you accountable by checking off all sorts of rubrics, and we're going to look at your test scores, and that's going to determine whether you're a good teacher or not, and not anything about your own professional expertise. So that's what we're facing, and the violence issues just make it even more difficult to recruit teachers. We are not down by as much as Eastern Michigan University. We're only about 40 to 45% down over the last 10 years, but only. Others are much higher. We're facing a crisis, and I think probably Dr. Vitti would be able to speak to this, and Dr. Swift. There's a looming crisis because people are going to start to retire, and there aren't well-prepared, well-trained teachers to take their place. So there's a difference between people who could come into classrooms and babysit and actually well-prepared and well-trained teachers.
So before I answered the specific question, I did want to, I did mention in my opening just what we're doing. And so one thing, put this in perspective. In walking into the district under over a decade of emergency management, and just to give everyone a quick history, very quick, Detroit has not been run by Detroiters. Detroit lost, if you want to say that, local control over a decade ago with emergency management. And I never talk about any individual emergency manager because I'm not in a place to judge any human being, but especially the emergency managers. But emergency managers were not educators. So these are individuals that basically were political appointments. So imagine running the most fragile school system in the country, and the lowest performing, in many ways, district in the country, led by an individual that had no education and no background in education. So not teacher, not principal, not even taking courses. So we talk about being certified. I mean, not even taking one course on what education leadership looks like. And so how in the world are you going to move a district that needs systems and processes when that's the case? And at the local level, there's no check and balances. So we talk about politics and a board. I mean, at the highest level, the board and the superintendent work together to create positive impact on children. And then, there's a check and balances, the executive and legislative type of structure. In Detroit, you had no check and balance. So the emergency manager reported to a governor and basically could do anything that he wanted with very little checks and balances. That said, walking in, we talk about this issue, we don't have guidance counselors at every one of our schools. So one thing we did in this new budget, which is the first budget actually created in alignment with the strategic plan based on local control, is funding a guidance counselor at every school. And multiple guidance counselors at the secondary level. We also are changing the code of conduct to require restorative justice, to implement in-school suspension programs, move away from out-of-school suspension, so that students are restored when they make mistakes. They learn from their mistakes, not just putting them out, because there's a direct link to our absenteeism problem, our truancy problems, and suspensions. So just to give you a quick snapshot of that, and then doing a lot of work with positive behavior support, so reinforcing the positive, not the negative, and training teachers and creating systems like that. One of our greatest challenges in Detroit is recognizing experience outside of Detroit. So we've only been able to, if a teacher worked 10 years in Southfield and wants to come to Detroit, we only gave 2 years of experience for that teacher. So no one, frankly, would leave Southfield to come to Detroit, even if they lived in Detroit, went through DPS, if they're only getting 2 years of experience, not 10. So we just had an agreement with our union that we're going to fully recognize experience starting next year. So for suburban districts, we're going to start recruiting. I think they're very happy here, so you don't have to worry about that. But there are, I think, other opportunities. There is a new energy in Detroit, and I think people want to come back, and that's where the greatest challenge is, but the greatest opportunity. And then recognizing experience that was not recognized in the school system over years of not seeing pay increases. I completely agree with Elizabeth as far as everything she said about why teachers are not entering the profession. And one thing that I would emphasize as a solution is you see a lot of quick fixes. You see what is called quick wins. And for politicians, quick wins are easy. What's hard is sustainable reform. And if you want to think about the lever that is most important in creating safe schools, most important in thinking of children reaching their academic and civic potential, and you're thinking about what investment matters most, it's in teachers. And we all say that. We all want to have a parade for teachers, and we all say the thankless job, and can we please invest in what matters? Yeah. And so, it's ironic. You see Google, and I always use this analogy. When a company is doing well, you invest more in that company. We do the complete opposite in K-12 public education. Even when we're doing more with less, even when we're overcoming high obstacles of poverty, English language learner status, special needs, and we still get kids to reach their potential and go on to college and overcome deep challenges, we fund it less. It makes no sense. So when companies are increasing profit, we invest more so they can invest more in new products and innovation. We do the exact opposite where it matters most, which is our children, and with individuals that have the greatest impact. So if we're going to get serious, we have to give incentives for undergraduates to go into the teaching profession, which means forgiving loans for college, which means tax breaks on buying homes, lower mortgage interest opportunities. And we have to, at least in the urban core, we have to have teachers live in the same communities as their children that they serve. We've lost that. So incentives linked to that. But we are not going to rebuild, I would say, Detroit, and I would say the school system, if we don't invest in teachers, even beyond the immediate ones in the system, but in advance. And so those are things that we can think about as how we get them back in the profession.
Can I just add one word to that?
Yeah, this
very
open
quick.
mic here.
Absolutely agree with that, and I just wanted to add, not only are we funding less, but we actually require less training for teachers. So at a time when all these things are true, right, it's a much more complex classroom environment because we have more people staying in school. That's great, but it means the diversity presents new challenges. We have more people speaking other languages. That's great. We want that, but it means that the work of a teacher is different than it was 20 years ago, 50 years ago. All these complexities add up, and what is the state doing? Lowering certification requirements. And that is another piece of, I think, what makes people not want to go into the teaching profession, because they think, well, anybody can do that. Anybody can walk into a classroom. That's not really a profession. So I would argue that we need to maintain and even increase certification requirements, which is why I'm in conversation with two district superintendents about building teaching residencies, residency programs in their districts in which we would continue to support the advanced training of teachers. So instead of decreasing, let's make it harder to be a teacher. Now that sounds counterintuitive, but that's about building a profession.
Yes.
We wouldn't have anybody walking into a surgical ward and operating on us. Why are we letting anybody walk into classrooms and teach our children?
Thank you.
I just want to, so I agree with everything Elizabeth said, but I think and this goes back to the politics, supply and demand. So agree that we should raise standards, but if we're going to raise standards, which I agree with, we got to support that. So then that's incentives for the top undergraduates to go into teaching. So this is what often happens in the state of politics is we need more rigor, we need more accountability, we need to increase standards, but then there's no funding and there's no thoughtfulness around how to build an infrastructure to allow that to happen. So I think this goes back to thoughtful policy, not reactionary policy on some of these issues.
I wanted to just touch back on the social emotional. I loved Dr. Vitti's the best metal detector is building a relationship with the child. I recently had an opportunity to be in a session and in conversation with the superintendent of Newtown Public Schools, a former superintendent there. And he was the leader who came in immediately after their shooting to put in the processes, procedures, and to try to help the community move forward. And he said to us, a room full of superintendents, if you can take one thing from me, it's this. And that is the number one preventive is to wrap arms around your most vulnerable and socially at-risk adults and children in your school community. And he said that needs to be your number one job. Separate from locking the perimeter, checking in at the front office, all of those things, make sure you know. I was struck just a couple of weeks ago at the Supreme Court hearing when the counter attorney arguing his case gave the example of the gun carrier coming into the school being someone known by the school. That makes it okay. This was his argument. I recall, and I was teaching just a few miles up the road in Colorado on the day of the Columbine shooting. I remember that day very, very, very clearly, 19 years ago, just over 19 years ago. Those Columbine shooters were known by the school. The Newtown shooter was known very well by the school. So I just want to really, you will not hear in the news, in the media, you will not hear in the political discussion that connection about social emotional supports and reducing school violence. But I appreciate that Dr. Vitti and President Stead have made that point, and also Elizabeth Moje, because it cannot be lost. What we're suffering from, and I know it's true for you, Dr. Vitti, is our community resources around social, emotional, mental health have been cut. So, school is a microcosm of the macro. And if 1 in 4 of us are struggling mentally with mental health, that's true in a school of 2,000 students. We could drive just a few blocks here and be at one of those. So we have got to reconnect that dot of taking care of folks when they're struggling socially, when they're struggling emotionally, when they have mental health issues. So I just wanted to connect that dot more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we're going to open things up a little bit
Sure.
to some questions. But I also wanted to acknowledge we have the Assistant Superintendent of M.H.S.
Yes,
Do you mind joining us up here for a minute?
Yes,
And maybe
come on
talk
down,
about Cheryl, is that it?
Cheryl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to also ask Bob Gilardi, who's familiar to a lot of us. Bob, come on up. And Bob is former principal in Ann Arbor. And
Former everything.
Former everything.
Yes.
No, we won't go there. Bob, come on up. And Bob has been, you can fill him in, but he's been working in the Detroit schools since his quote retirement from Ann Arbor about a decade ago or whatever it is. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the efforts you're putting in. But let me start with Cheryl, and maybe you could comment or ask a question, however you want to do this. Cheryl, I should say.
That's okay. Truly, it's an
Just hold
honor.
the mic real close.
Okay. Truly, it's an honor to be here this morning. I would like to also recognize one of our board members, Maria Sheila Edwards, who's in our audience here.
Yeah.
So when we think about the discussion of gun violence in schools, it is truly indicative of just the overall perspective of what children are thinking today. Sometimes when we think about children in feeling valued in our schools, feeling appreciated, yesterday we had an appreciation for our teachers, and that's where it begins. Where children come into the classroom, our teachers are able to celebrate them and to appreciate them, to make them feel appreciated in terms of, how do you feel today? Just having that relationship, being able to speak with them one-on-one, helping them to be able to feel a community in that classroom, helping them to be able to understand their purpose in life, the greater good of everything. Our superintendent, Dr. Benjamin Edmondson, is very adamant about building relationships with children and helping them to be able to feel successful. Our children presented last night. That's where it begins. Highlighting our kids, making them feel valued, helping them to feel that they are the most important thing in our society. And so when they feel that value, then they don't turn to gun violence, because what happens in our society a lot of times are gangs begin to recruit them in the absence of parenting or in the absence of educators being able to meet their needs. And so one of the panelists yesterday spoke to the teachers and talked about how when a child tells you that he's thinking about being a part of the Crips, how you engage that child in a conversation and you begin to ask him, so what is appealing about that? And so when you replace those types of conversations with those that say to you, so what are your dreams in life? And how can I help you be able to advance with that dream? That's where it begins as well, in the classroom with our children and with our teachers and our principals.
Good morning, everyone. I'm surprised to be up here. Also happy.
Dressed well, though.
Oh, thank you. Almost keep this on. Actually, I was principal of Pioneer 19 years ago when Columbine occurred. And so the only comment I want to make is I really agree with everything that's been said. Is what I said to the students on the intercom, that day was our only protection is each other. And so I guess the message that we heard this morning from everyone up here is that the greatest protection, yes, metal detectors, because I consult in Detroit now all of the time. I'm going down to Ben Carson today. Is we have to take care of each other. We have to look out for each other because those people who aren't known in a school, that person who never gets connected to anything, is the person that becomes alienated and can be a problem. Whether it's just disrupting in a classroom or it's the shooting type things, all of this kind of stuff really requires the human touch. And I've worked in Ann Arbor for 32 years. I've been in Detroit now for about 8, working in high schools. Kids are the same everywhere. They need us. They need teachers that care about them. And somehow this august group here needs to help us figure out how to support them. How to support them.
Go ahead, you have something?
Wait.
Let me have.
Yeah. Okay.
As a psychologist, I want to just I'll make a comment and you can talk on it. It's the rise of anxiety as the #1 mental health disorder right now. For a while we talk about opioids, we talk about drugs in the schools. These to me are often signs of anxiety. And I teach at one of the most august places in the country, which is the Ross School of Business. So I have the elite of the elite. And the anxiety level among those students, well, I do a course on self-development, self-awareness, and when they have a chance to talk about the terrible stresses on them, I mean, there's anorexia, there's OCD, I mean, there's all kinds of things that they're experiencing. And I just imagine, I taught in Harlem for a while, as your wife did, Nikolai, and the stresses that you mentioned, just living in the environment. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask about this was parenting, because I have 2 granddaughters, 4 and 2, and they have a very enriched environment to grow up in. They have parents who are both educated, they have a nanny, they have all kinds of privileges. But I also have worked with families where there's teenage parents, there's parents that are completely unprepared for parenting. They're not bad people, but they don't have money and they don't have any training on how to do parenting. So are there any programs that you guys are reaching out now to try to help parents, even of the younger children, to get them prepared so that at the time they hit kindergarten, they're now already 2 years behind?
So, one, I think this is an important issue even when we think about the importance of public education. Because even whether in theory or I would say in reality, the vehicle for equal opportunity and social justice and change is public education.
That's right.
They're synonymous. You can't have one without the other. And what's happening in our country as the commitment and funding, and it's not just funding. So I know we as public educators always talk about funding, and people that are strapped economically hate to hear that. It becomes a political conversation about, enough money here, enough money there. But when you really take a step away from the politics and just think about what public education means, and the notion behind it is that regardless of socioeconomic background, regardless of who your parents are or not, regardless of the zip code that you grow up in, that if you are able to go to a school starting in pre-K, even earlier than that, but let's just say 4 years old, 5 years old. The premise is that regardless of that, the obstacles, whatever they may be, regardless of the disadvantages in a country full of inequity, that you can go to school every day and learn how to think, how to critically think, analyze, exposed to ideas around culture, expose art and music. At the highest level, that is the only way you can do better than the generation before you, if you just stop and think about it. So if we are really about equal opportunity, which again, I question whether we really are, and I think that's a legitimate fact that you can ask. But if we try to go back to our principles of this country, again, never truly implemented, but strive to get to that point, then it has to be public education, which is that vehicle. And so as it's eroded, it's lost. So going back to parents then, I, as a teacher, principal, superintendent, I always say that we take children from where they're at. We can't change that. So if they are way down here academically, then we have to strive to take them here. If they're here, we have to take them here. If they're up here, then how do we take them higher? That's the concept. So the reality of what's happening in the home is real, and we can't ignore it. But I try not to use it as the excuse. I use it as the opportunity. So with that said, I completely agree with your point. Every parent cares about their child's education.
Sure.
The only parent that doesn't care, and what you perceive as not caring, are those parents that are dealing with deep addiction issues that overcome everything, keeping a job, even influencing parenting. Now, socioeconomic background influences the amount of involvement that a parent has in their child's education. Their own education attainment interferes, influences their role in education. So what we're doing in Detroit is creating a parent academy. And this was based on my own dissertation and research, frankly based on what I saw with my mother, who dropped out of high school and went on to get her GED, which was, my mother did care about my education, but was very intimidated by the process. So she stayed away, no different than I tried to stay away from the doctor. So it was because she didn't do well. She felt hypocritical to say, you have to do your homework, you have to do that, or to advocate even in the classroom or with the teacher. So the Parent Academy focuses on 3 areas. 1, how to build the capacity of our parents to be more confident in the educational experience of their child. So we offer classes on what questions to ask during a parent-teacher conference. What does this 3rd grade retention policy look like, and what does it mean? How do you fill out a FAFSA form to get financial aid? How do you promote literacy in the home? How do you promote critical thinking? I told you about my mother, but my mother also was brilliant in just common sense. And she was a natural thinker where I remember being very young, sitting on a couch watching the news, and she would always say, Nikolai, do you agree or disagree with the mayor? And that naturally made me think, right? And then at the dinner table, whether it was my uncle or grandparents, it was a constant conversation about life and politics. None of them had an education, but they made me think. They made me actively involved in society, and that's what we can teach our parents as they're working with their children, regardless of how they did in school. Other component of the Parent Academy is how to deal with parenting issues. So how to pick friends, how to monitor social media, how to deal with conflict and anger. Our parents only know what they know. So if they deal with issues in a way that is that sometimes even promotes more conflict and violence, how do we take a step back and rethink how to deal with those issues that are natural? And then the last piece is, how do we help parents overcome the socioeconomic challenges that get in the way of playing more of a role in their child's education? So we're offering classes on how to write a resume, job interviewing classes, financial literacy, so how do you build credit to eventually buy a home. And we're doing this not only by ourselves, with nonprofits, with banks that offer financial literacy classes. We're going to churches, we're going to where parents are, not to where we are. And we believe this can be an engine of change so that we're building the capacity of our parents. But as I always say, our parents give us the best they have. Okay, so it's our role to take children to another place, civically, academically, so we don't use that as an excuse as to what we can't do with parents. But it's a legitimate challenge, but that's what public education is all about.
Thank you. I want to bring up Manal Asi, who's psychiatrist, a friend of mine, and you have some comments on this.
Yes, first I want to say thank you for putting this together. This is great. I'm a child psychiatrist here, a child and adolescent psychiatrist in Ann Arbor. I am also a proud parent of a Pioneer student. I sit on the Council of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, which is our national organization. And every year we go and do mental health advocacy on Capitol Hill in DC. And this year, sure. So every year we go and do mental health advocacy day there. I don't do a lot of speaking. We do mental health advocacy in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill every April. And so we were there along with the American Academy of Pediatrics. Their number one agenda on that day was to consider gun safety as a public health crisis. Yes. And that was sort of the angle that they were taking. For us, for the child psychiatrists, our number one ask from our legislators was to bring mental health into the schools. We strongly believe that if we have more mental health counselors in the schools, not more arm the teachers in the schools, that you can recognize problems early on. We talk about macroaggression when something like a mass shooting happens, but there's microaggressions, bullying, cyberbullying, all that cumulative stuff that happens over time. If the counselors are there, they recognize the symptoms, they recognize the signs, we can intervene early before a mass shooting happens. And this is why a lot of us in child psychiatry, we really think about intervene early before things become substance abuse, school refusal, high school dropout, mass shooting, depression, anxiety, suicide. That's the other thing we haven't talked about, is that we're having a lot of suicides, even in Ann Arbor schools. And we're not talking about that. That's sort of, we talk about aggression on the other, but people also implode and take that aggression on themselves. That is suicide. And so we really want to advocate for mental health into the schools as sort of like the number one strategy and what we think is probably the most effective intervention.
Let me ask you a personal question, if you don't mind. I know you grew up in Beirut during the war, the continuing war, but the worst part of it. So there must have been a lot of violence around you. How did they cope with it in your schools?
So I was debating whether I should say something about that. So when you were saying about like the U.S. being the number one for guns, I think Lebanon was probably more, maybe an outlier. But we also had civil war for 18 years. I grew up feeling that the world is not a safe place. And when I immigrated here, and parents and teachers would tell the kids that this is a safe world, I'm like, why are you lying to them? It's not a safe world. You gotta equip them. They have to be ready to recognize when there's danger. This is not okay. I happen to live in an unsafe world, and I know what it feels like to walk around seeing trauma every day. And I immigrated here hoping that I would spare my child that experience. And it's really heartbreaking for me to see that being replicated in this country. I chose this country by choice. I wasn't born here. I immigrated here. And to see that happen here is really heartbreaking.
We have a couple minutes, about 10 minutes, so we'd like to hear from anybody. Are there anybody, teachers out there that have any comments? I'll give them first opportunity. Any people who are educators that want to make any comments from the fronts of the word. Okay. If not, we'll go to Larry. Come on up. Just shout it out, Larry.
Okay, very honored. If someone wants to cause harm with a weapon, they can find a way. How we're going to get that into people's minds that that's wrong, and as Christine said, this is not who we are. Well, what are we? What do we believe? Is the mantra run, hide, and fight? Or is it love, care, and help?
Christine.
Thanks for that comment, Larry. I'll bring maybe a different circumstance about that to me came to mind when you were speaking that helps us think about who are we in answering that question. And the context in this case is some of the racially charged posters and things that were going up on U of M's campus. And I had an opportunity during that time to talk to a student group that was an underrepresented minority group. And they were saying, what should we do? How do we be heard and let our voice be heard in this case? Part of what the thinking was is that the group that was doing this weren't even U of M students. They were just there to inspire the kind of controversy and outrage that they were getting. And so part of my advice to this group will, one, be diligent, stay present, continue to show up to the Board of Regents and make sure that's being heard. But at the same time, really, is this us? Do we really believe that about us? And maybe we start giving a little less credit to those kind of groups that we know aren't us. We know that's not who we are. So maybe we start spending a little less time amplifying their voice and a little more time amplifying the kind of values around loving and caring each other, looking out for each other, wanting everyone to do as best they can, and living that. Maybe we do more of that and spend more time and energy on that because we know that's who we are, and we give that other voice and those actions a lot less of our mental and emotional and social media attention. Let's give them what they deserve, which is not very much, because that's not who we are.
We're going to wrap up, and I'd like you to, we're going to write about this next week for my blog, and I think we have a reporter here from the Ann Arbor News that's also going to be writing about it. So I'd like to think about, when we wrap up things, I do this with teaching, what are your action items or your takeaways?
Hey, Rob, we got a critical question about school bullying.
I'm only here because I have to be here. My son has not been in school for a month.
Wait a minute. Can you hold on just 1 second? I don't want to disrupt the process. We'll give you a voice in a minute. I don't want to be disruptive.
I have to ask this question.
Okay. So we'll take that question in a minute, but I wanted each of you to think about what are the action items that you would say, take it away for yourself, and also that you would encourage the audience to take away. And I'd like the audience to also think about doing this, and you can send me an email, and I will be happy to include your comments, so that if there's something that you think that we're talking to basically leaders in the community, what are some of the things that you can do, that we should be doing to help with creating a safe environment? I'm sorry, what is, you had, I'm not opening up to general questions, but it seemed like you had a...
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I did. My son has not been in school for a month. I advocated in his school, and I've witnessed multiple occasions of violence, and then 4 occasions of him being bullied by one particular student. Now, it's not a gun. He's being stabbed with a pencil. He's using it as a form of a weapon. There is nothing being done at school level. I've contacted the superintendent. At what point do you go to the authorities to show my son that this is not okay in this world? Because now he's angry.
Okay, fair question. I'd like to address it. Our brave superintendent.
Well, we absolutely take situations like this very, very seriously, because we have not accomplished our work until every child feels safe. I want to make sure that I would want to make sure that we've reached out up and down the system if that has already occurred. We absolutely work with our law enforcement authorities. We do, because we will take whatever steps are necessary to ensure that situations in schools and classrooms are safe for everyone who's present there. So I know sometimes things get a little off track. Dr. Vitti and I work every day, as does Cheryl, on this work to put things back on track when they get off track, and to make sure that our children feel safe. But I will share, I'm not embarrassed to say, we do work with the authorities when there are situations where folks are not safe or where they don't feel safe. We get help when we need it, and I know we'll be happy to follow up. So, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know about your particular issue, but I'll try to take what I think I heard and try to scale it. It can be frustrating. You brought up the point of 1 in 4, and then you multiply that by the size of the school or the district, and so we talk about this, we all agree, and then reality hits.
Yeah.
And so I don't know about your particular situation, but as a parent who has children in public schools, my children will come home and tell me stories about other kids all the time, and how they're affected negatively by other children. And I would say this is a reality of life, and I'm not downplaying that at all. But even when we all go to work, we meet someone who looks troubled, that acts troubled with other people. So the question is, what do we do about it? And I think that's what we're trying to do better as a school system. And I'm going to speak for all schools throughout the country because I think everyone is trying on this. But it's rethinking how we deal with discipline. It's rethinking how we deal with mental health. And can we get to a point where we're going deeper to understand what's happening, what's the manifestation of that behavior, and how do we solve it from a discipline point of view, but more importantly from a mental health point of view, so that we can provide the right kind of social-emotional support intervention, and then think about how we place that child maybe in a different environment temporarily as we rebuild the student to come back. For lots of parents, what I just said, some will agree with it ideologically, some will automatically disagree with it ideologically, and then some are in the middle because they see the reality of what that looks like. And what that looks like is patience. But I say patience, but you got to function with the sense of urgency. You can see how even talking about it is complicated and difficult because it is hard stuff to do, especially when you're operating from a point of view where it's not funded to deal with it adequately. So this is why people run to private schools, because you then control who's coming in a little bit more based on socioeconomics. You have less issues that come up, and you have more resources to deal with the issues when they arise. So this is also why you're seeing a fleeting of people from public schools, and you have for decades. And this is also creating the cycle of the erosion of public education throughout this country. I'm not trying to give easy solutions, and I'm offering complicated answers, but because it is complicated. And we have to continue to work and hone the process until we get it right for every individual child. That's hard from a training perspective, from a resource perspective, but that's what we have to get to in this country, is when these issues arise, how do we deal with that individual child and restore that child so they can interact appropriately with other children and not force a reactive model that puts kids in prison. That's happening with kids of color, and it's happening with kids that are growing up without the socioeconomic resources to deal with. And that kind of approach is spreading throughout our country to even suburban areas where we're creating a reactionary, penalizing approach to these hardcore mental health issues that have to be resolved.
And if you're part of Ann Arbor Public Schools, I'd be happy, and Dr. Swift and I would both be happy to follow up with you after this meeting, just so that we know your specifics. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. Thank you.
And likewise, in Ypsilanti Community Schools,
Could you please hold it close, Joe?
we operate very transparently. I always like to have a conversation with the parent, with all the parties involved, because that's where that voice begins to be heard. Many times there are victims on both sides. You know, I know your child is the victim in this instance, but sometimes that other child is also a victim of some other circumstance. Our children have PTSD many times, and so they come with a lot of baggage to the schools, and so unfortunately they inflict some of that that's happening to them on other students. But I would encourage you to just continue to advocate for your child, because I always tell parents that regardless of what we as a district can do, you are the largest advocacy for your child. And if it means going to the authorities, then that's what you'll have to do. But always, of course, give us as district leaders that opportunity, because we're always seeking to, okay. And I understand, I know. And sometimes, you know, we have exhausted every avenue, but at that same time, you know, when we've tried, sometimes coming in with a different thought or perspective, just to have that new conversation, maybe having some other people get involved just to see how can we resolve this. Because the advocacy is also from the school level, we want your child to stay in school, right? Because attendance is important.
Cheryl, can I wanted to just give Bob another word here. We're going to wrap up in a couple minutes, but I want to give everybody last. So you have to go, I understand. David, thank you for coming. David Tarver is head of entrepreneurship at Wayne State, so thanks for coming in today. I just wanted to say that some of these things aren't new. When we talk about it like, oh, this is a crisis. I went to a nice middle-class Ferndale High School in the 60s, 50s and 60s. I was bullied. I started to write about it the other day, and I was too embarrassed to publish it. You know, the things that happened to me in elementary school. There was a kid that sat behind me who was very rich and, you know, the popular kid at school, pounded me in the shoulder for an entire year, you know, hitting me in the arm, and I was afraid to step up because I was going to get in trouble, you know, and yet he got away with this. Same thing with the Me Too movement. I mean, I know so many of my classmates were dating teachers, and many of, there was a teacher who was known for recruiting kids into his homosexual network, you know, that I didn't learn about it until years later, but these things have been going on, so it's not like we're in a crisis now. That it's just that we're talking about it, and I appreciate that. So Bob, speaking of that, you have some comments about adverse circumstances.
Yeah, I just wanted, one thing that I think everyone here could do is look up adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. And if you do that, you'll learn about, actually, we have many children that are walking around as if they were a veteran with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Absolutely.
This is what we're dealing with many of the students in our schools. And, you know, this comes out of, you know, learning more about the kids, which is another reason that we really must support teachers who are working on so many different levels with children. We need to support that, because when they do it, then we're wrapping our arms around them.
Yeah, This American Life, the podcast, has done a wonderful series on Chicago, growing up in Chicago schools. They were in schools for a couple of years. I would highly recommend listening to that if you want some more information about this. And if you have other resources, I'll be happy to publish that when we do our event about this, whether it's next Monday or the week after. So if you have comments and things that you'd like to see happen, resources that you would like to make available. Most of all, I wish we could keep this dialogue going. So it's so interesting. I didn't know what to expect when we got everybody together, but it's just feels like we could go on all day and just learn so much. And we're listening, you know, I think we're talking to the converted here, so it'd be really nice to get a dialogue where people are having the opposite point of view and have some conversation about it, because I know you're all advocating certain things and you're struggling a lot with the legislator, and people have very, very different ideas about how to go about solving the problem. So any other comments, Jeanice? I'll let you have a last comment if you'd like. And,
Robert, thank you for the opportunity. It's a great conversation. I appreciate being involved today. Thank you.
Anybody else, the last comment?
Same. We need to do this more in every city, and I do want to say we have to start working more together across cities and school districts.
Absolutely.
And so it's hard. There's a lot of work happening right now in Detroit with rebuilding the district. But every time I get a chance to walk outside of Detroit to have these conversations, I try to do that, because what has happened to Detroit with bad policy can happen anywhere throughout the country.
That's right.
And Michigan. So the totality of what happened may not happen, but there are elements of what has happened that can start to creep into other school districts throughout the country and in Michigan. And your message about how we vote is so important.
Yes.
And I assume most of you are voters, but how do we get everyone to vote? And how do we get candidates that are actually going to tackle problems and not just give platitudes to get elected. And I would say that's one of our major issues right now is policy, and elections matter federally and at the state level.
What percentage of people vote in the school board, in the millage elections?
I think that statistically about 20 to 30%. That's more nationally. I don't know what that looks like.
Last one here was 12.
Yeah.
It was done by the last two years.
Right.
May 8th.
May 8th is another.
Yes.
I have one. Christy, go ahead.
No, that's okay.
Go ahead. Take a.
Well, I just reiterate what Nikolai said very eloquently, but politics matters and who you vote for matters. We know this, but it's never been more important than now, and I would just encourage you all to be very active and vote. May 8th also is an election. This is something that's forced on us by our state. Proposal A said, communities, you have to ask yourself every 10 to 20 years whether you want to continue to fund public education or not. That's the vote on Tuesday, May 8th. Do we want to continue to fund public education in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or not? That's the vote in front of us.
That's the vote.
It's our operating millage. It's how we pay our teachers and staff. We have to do this by law. We've decided to do it for the next 20 years, so we're not coming back to our voters for some period of time on this particular question because we think Ann Arbor actually kind of likes to support public education and we might get a good yes there. That being said, it's been surprising and disappointing. Some of our last election turnouts post the November 16th election. We have had ballot issues since then, and we were just expecting, so we never take this for granted. Come and vote. Come vote May 8th. Come vote in November. It matters.
The question was, who are we? We're foundation builders. As educators, we build the lives of children to make a difference every day so that all of us will have an opportunity to stand on their shoulders as they're standing on ours today.
Yay.
I want to also encourage people not only to vote, but anybody want to have fun? Nobody out there had fun? Michael, come on, let's see if you can get somebody out here to have fun this summer. Talk about the summer fest. Is Michael here? Not here. All right. Well, let me just talk about the summer fest is going to be going on. The director was here for a while, but he must have left. So that'll be great this summer. Just shout out real quick what you have, and you can hand it out. Just take a quick second.
I'm Jan Davies McDermott, and I do a lot of work with the Athena Foundation. Athena supports and develops women leaders. If you enjoyed this conversation, I want to link what we are doing on May 22nd to, and you will recognize some of the names that I'm going to mention. In conjunction with the LPGA that's coming to town, we are honoring women in business, government, education, and sport. We have a morning forum that includes Mary Morgan hosting a panel with Debbie Dingle, Rebecca Warren, Amanda Edmonds, Mandy Grewal, Ingrid Sheldon. So if you want a talk about government and how women can be involved in government in the future, that's the government panel you want to hear. We're following that up with a panel of business leaders. Terry Merritt from Walbridge, Mary Bushwig, I always get that wrong, from Lucerne International, Marie Clough, who heads the Art Association now, but also a very successful entrepreneur, Clonlaris leader in education, Chandra Montgomery Nickel, a panel filled with business, profit, nonprofit, education, and sport leaders. We have. I need to say one more thing on the benefit of the University of Michigan. Our keynote speaker for lunch and the woman who is receiving the Athena Leadership Award this year is Kathy White, the University of Michigan Regent. She is a colonel in the Army, and she's a professor at Wayne State Law. So I encourage you to take a flyer, come, and for those of you, just because you're Robert's friends at LeadersConnect, I have a discount coupon for you all.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, the LPGA, I think we should honor my 95-year-old mother-in-law who just moved here. Is living in the same building. She has 4 holes in one. And so, she's like a mediocre golfer, but so I think that deserves, Imogene Carino ought to get an award if that. So with that, I'd like to thank you all. And, you know, some people have to run, but please come up and we can continue the conversation. We had a room for a while. And I want to thank you all for coming. Dr. Vitti coming to report. We'll have this video out sometime in the near future. Feel free to distribute it.
Everything's going well. Great job. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it was wonderful.
Really good to meet you. I'm Ken Fisher. I live here in Ann Arbor.
I use this public school. Okay.
With the music society.
Okay.